Hey out there, today is Monday, July 12th, 2021. Coming up on the show today, from Black Widow, editor Matthew Schmidt.
It's not just editing itself, it's the juggling act of studio execs and directors and personalities and being able to play kind of a political game of sorts, navigating all these different personalities.
And editor Lee Folsom Boyd.
It was like an embarrassment of riches because there's so much material to work with. And it was just deciding what did we need to convey to the audience in that moment.
Yes, all that and a lot more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Okay, hello again, my friends. Happy Monday. Happy Blockbuster Day. That's right, big summer movies are back, and it does not get any bigger than Marvel's Black Widow, which is what we're here to talk about today. That's right, editors Matthew Schmidt and Lee Folsom Boyd are on the show today to share with you their experience cutting Black Widow, the film that is kicking off the next phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which I believe is Phase 4. One of the many things I love about these big movies is that I don't have to waste a lot of your time explaining what the movie is about. You know Marvel, you know Natasha Black Widow Romanoff. Now she has her own film that gives us her backstory, and like all Marvel films, sets up a new arc for us to eagerly await. This is definitely not the first Marvel rodeo for either Matt or Lee, and certainly not the first for them when it comes to big movies. In fact, Matt has assisted on films like The Avengers and Iron Man 3, and then moved on to co-editing Captain America Civil War and Winter Soldier, as well as Avengers Age of Ultron, Infinity War, and Endgame. And as for Lee, she's co-edited Spider-Man Far From Home and Ant-Man, and possibly could be working on another Marvel film right now. Not sure. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Forget I mentioned it. But please do not forget to check out our two Rough Cut sponsors. It would mean a lot to me and a great way to show them that you appreciate their role in bringing you this interview with Matt and Lee. One of those sponsors helps you move media, the other makes media that helps you move your audience. Let's start with our new friends at Massive. Yes, MASV Massive have made it their life's work to solve your most challenging media problems, namely how to easily, safely, and efficiently share even the most enormous of media files that result from you shooting all that glorious high-res media. Now, what do you have to do to make all that happen? Well, you simply create an account to quickly transfer terabytes of data over the cloud. Massive's pay-as-you-go model means you only pay for what you need, and there are no limits to the size of the file that you can share. So you can send uncompressed videos to teams around the world and speed up your production cycle, and honestly, who doesn't need that? If you sign up today at Massive, massive.io/theroughcut, THE-ROUGH-CUT, you can get 100 gigabytes free towards your transfer. How about that? I will put a link in the show notes to make it easy for you, but once again, that's massive.io/theroughcut for 100 gigabytes free towards your transfer. And now that you have access to the very best way to share media amongst your production team, make sure that you have the very best in production audio to share as well. And for that, you know you can turn to our friends at Extreme Music. For over 20 years, they have been providing content creators in the film, TV, and gaming industries with amazing music created by the top names in the production and composing game. Just visit their website, extrememusic.com, and do a quick keyword search on just about every aspect of music to find just what you need. Their vast catalog of music is available to you to customize right down to the instrumentation of the track so that you get just what you want in a way that suits your story best. It is free to try, it is fun to do, and it is the very best way for you to ensure that your project sounds great. You can do it all online or with a live representative, we'll just assume they're alive, at an office near you all around this world of ours. So do not wait. The next time you have a great story to tell, visit Extreme Music and give your audience the gift of great music. Okay, I have a little gift for you as well, and that's a chance to meet and learn from our special guests today, Black Widow editors Matthew Schmidt and Lee Folsom Boyd. When did it start? Do you remember?
May 2019.
That's got to be, I don't know if it's a record, but that's a long time.
For Marvel, it's a record, I think.
So much attention has been put on this film for so many reasons. You know, kicking off the next theatrical phase of the MCU, giving the character of Natasha Romanoff her own signature film. But outside of that also is just sort of a bellwether sign of the return to the movie-going experience. You know, the film was originally slated for release in May 2020, then bumped to November 2020, and then I believe May 21 until its ultimate release this past weekend. So all of which reminds me of a quote that a wise editor once said, and that's, you never actually finish these movies, they just take them away from you because it's time to release them. So I guess we'll start with how close to being done were you when the film was first pushed out, and were you able to leverage the additional time that was added on to continue working on and refining things?
We were pretty close to finishing. You know, we were on the first week of the final mix. So we're on the mixing stage, kind of locking picture. You know, things were going pretty smoothly until, you know, they came in and said, hey, look, there's something going on. And we're thinking we're going to go take a little pause. Everybody will go home. nobody knew how bad the situation was or, how it would kind of spin out of control. We really thought that we would be kind of up and going in a couple weeks again. And evidently that's not the case. But we were pretty close to locking picture, and having the extra time, Lee, was beneficial.
Definitely beneficial. We did leverage it to get a little more time with visual effects. And we tried to put a pin in it, like Matt was saying, like we were so close to locking picture. So that was the goal, not to go back in and make a mess of things. Because visual effects were so close, it allowed us to have a little more time for a couple of key visual effects shots. And it did allow us to go back and take a beat and then look at the movie again on the whole, and then just do a few tweaks. Everyone was good. No one went back and said, no, we need to totally do this again. We have time, because everyone was really happy with the movie for the most part before we got shut down.
And we never knew how long the shutdown was going to last. Knowing now, definitely there's things that we could have gone back in and refined and changed a little bit, because up until the pandemic hit and we started working from home and pushing the release date and stuff, we were just going full bore.
Yeah.
It was just kind of an insane schedule, from finishing shooting to the director's cut to previews to reshoots. It was one of the more intense ones that we had. And then all of a sudden it came to a grinding halt.
Yeah.
And bought us more time, which was nice.
Yeah. I think the whole crew was thankful just to be told we have to take a pause. We're just going to take a breath and figure out what the world is doing.
Well, what adjustments did you have to make once you went remote in terms of the actual editing process and setup? I mean, was it harder to work on things like visual effects and sound without these giant screens and elaborate audio monitoring capabilities? Maybe you both have really kick-ass home theaters, I don't know. But, once you're home, this is a big movie with big visual effects and big sounds. How do you make that adjustment in a remote model?
I have to say that the IT department at Marvel is amazing, which we knew, but I have even more respect because while the world shut down, they did not. Like, they had a huge responsibility to keep the executives and the filmmakers. They had to figure it out and keep everyone going. Just huge props to everyone on the technical support. But, it is different because no one was used to working at home to the extent that everyone was forced to work at home. And no, my system at home is not kick-ass like you would expect, from the studio screening rooms and stuff like that, our visual effects reviews. My at-home system does not compare. And so, again, technical support really tried to help the key people to make sure that their screens were all calibrated as well as possible and to get everyone on the same page. But still, we're not all looking at the same shot on the same platform. So we just kind of make do. And our visual effects supervisor, Jeff Bauman, he and the vendor are working to make sure that it's looking as precise and clear and everything is spot on, because you start giving a little bit of latitude, that's just the lag in the internet right now, or that shot doesn't really skip like that. You take for granted that someone's doing quality control.
You both were already a part of the Marvel family, and with few exceptions, once you edit a Marvel film, you don't often end up doing just one. You go on to do others, which I think speaks highly of both the editor and the studio. So editors, like in a TV series, end up being more of a constant in the franchise than the directors. I mean, there are definitely directors like the Russo brothers, Peyton Reed, John Watts, who did or are doing multiple films. But more often than not, I think the editor has more, quote, Marvel experience than the directors. And that's certainly the case here with Kate Shortland, who is not only doing her first Marvel film, but first, I think, big movie of this kind. So rather than talk about how you got the gig, I'd like to know what you talked about with Kate in terms of her vision for the film and how she may have leaned on both of you for your expertise with both the Marvel franchise and these kinds of big blockbuster movies.
Yeah, that was an interesting one because both Lee and I have experience with Marvel and know kind of how they work and the ins and outs and the quirks. And I know when I first interviewed with Kate, she had actually come in while I was doing Endgame and looked at some of the scenes with Scarlett and just to kind of see her performance and where the movie was going. And we had a nice discussion then. And then a couple months later, I interviewed for Black Widow with her, and she really kind of embraced the fact that I knew the stories, the history, the characters really well, especially Natasha. So it worked out beneficially for sure for Lee and I, for a certain degree. And then you have to find your way with the director. Once they start shooting, it becomes a different beast. It's whole learning curve, especially for Kate on this movie, because it was, so big and so many moving parts and so many people and questions and visual effects and blue screen and stuff that was a whole different realm to her. So she always knew she could turn to Lee and I, which she embraced at times. And also at other times, she distanced herself. so she could kind of focus on making the movie and making the movie that she wanted to make and why they hired her in the first place, and not get too involved in the whole ideas of what Natasha and the Marvel Universe was. They do an amazing job at hiring directors for their unique perspective and what they bring to the table. And Kate really made a beautiful movie that's not quite a Marvel movie, but boy, at times it feels like it. And it was on and off again with us, with Kate, where it was like she would embrace us and then step aside and kind of do her thing. And it was an interesting process. To build the trust, too, with a director you've never worked with, it's tricky.
Exactly, because like Matt said really well, it's like we had to start from scratch with Kate. Like the studio knows us, but Kate doesn't have that experience with us. And we're working with her first and foremost. We're working to bring her vision of the film to the screen and to tell the story that she wants to tell. And so that's where we always had to start at and go back to, like, how can we help you tell the story in the way that reflects how you want it to be told?
You know, Kate came from the indie world where, you know, everything was kind of more contained, smaller. It had to be really planned out, budget and logistics and stuff. And Marvel, it's like, here's the studio that we're shooting at. We have the use of all these stages and all these people, utilize them and do what you want to do and shoot the movie that how you want to shoot it. But it's building trust. And that takes a while, because I think at certain points, Kate sat there and was like, they're Marvel. You know, they've done Marvel movies before, and I'm trying to do something that's not quite like that. So I want to do my own thing. And Lee and I would discuss it. We're like, I think she likes us. I don't know. I think she gets us. You know, it's one of those things, because shooting a movie is really hard. You know, we're in our offices, we're doing our work. You know, we go down to set, it's kind of chaotic, but we don't see the day-to-day decision-making and everything that really adds to the stress level of directors. And it's finding that balance and making them aware that we're there to help her achieve what she wants.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that's so good at Marvel, because they have a vision of what they want the movie to be. But at the end of the day, they've hired a director for that special eye or that special look or the special feeling that they think that that specific director is going to bring to that specific project. So the studio is very supportive of that process as well, and careful not to put the director in the same box as the movie before, you know? They hired Kate, like Matt said, for a specific reason, because they enjoyed her previous work and they wanted her to bring her style to the movie. And she did so beautifully.
As you'd expect, there's a lot of buzz around this film already. I saw an article called The 7 Movies You Should See Before Black Widow, which was all about educating the viewer as to her history in the franchise, going all the way back to Iron Man 2 and up to Avengers Endgame. You two don't have the luxury of assuming that a viewer has the 23 MCU movies prior to Black Widow in their back pocket, let alone those suggested 7 movies. So I'd like to hear about the challenge and the iterations the film may have gone through in creating a movie that can stand on its own as much as possible, even if Black Widow is the first Marvel film an audience member has ever seen.
Well, I think that, like you said, as you're going through the iterations, you're asking yourself, is this going to make sense to someone who doesn't have those backstories and doesn't have the knowledge of all the other films? And when you get to a point where, no, the viewer needs to know that, then how can we clarify that for them? So a new viewer doesn't sit there and is totally lost and walk out thinking this was a complete waste of their time because they had to know all the backstories. And so I think just constantly being aware of that and asking ourselves as the filmmakers those questions so that we could fill in the gaps or make it so that it didn't matter. Like, you could know that something happened, but you might not know the specific of what happened, but it still wasn't bogging you down in not being able to enjoy the film.
You can pretty much follow without seeing really any of the other movies. It's kind of a self-contained. We introduce a lot of characters in it, and it has that going for it. Even if you haven't seen the movies, you probably know who Black Widow is and Natasha Romanoff and, you know, Scarlett Johansson and the part that she plays. And there's some backstory in it that kind of clarifies some stuff. It's one of those hard things, especially after we're working on Marvel movies, that we just assume people have seen these movies. You know, we sometimes go into it and somebody goes, oh, that doesn't really make sense. And there's some stuff that you have to clarify, but I mean, there's things that you have to kind of know, but it doesn't take you out of the movie, or it doesn't confuse an audience member if they haven't seen all the movies or some of the movies.
Well, because of the scope of these Marvel films, generally, as is the case here, there's more than one editor. So I guess that begs the question, how is the editorial workload balanced between the two of you? Is it whomever can get to the next scene first? Is it alternating scenes, or is it based on the type of scene that dictates who does what?
Yeah, I cut all the drama, the love story stuff. There's no love story. No, you know what? Lee was finishing up Spidey,
Yeah.
weren't you? The
Yeah.
first one at the time. So I started first in London. So I was cutting everything that was coming in, and then Lee came and she grabbed like the next couple scenes. Couple of them were coin tosses, where it was like we tried to break up the action scenes so we weren't all bogged down with a bunch of action just because that gets relentless at times with visual effects and post-viz and pre-viz. And if you have too many action scenes on one editor or the other, it just gets to be a little bit too much to juggle, especially with the fast pace that we're moving. So we kind of just divided and conquered and then made sure that it was kind of balanced.
And we were constantly talking with each other and showing each other scenes and just collaborating with each other about story and stuff like that to make sure that we were, both on the same page with everything. So that also helped a lot.
Yeah, and you spoke about working with Kate and working with the new director and stuff. And Lee and I have both done Marvel movies in the past, but we've never worked together. We knew each other from like working from down the hall from each other years ago, but we had never worked with each other. And that's also an interesting dynamic. How do you divide the movie? How do who's doing what? What kind of relationship will we have together and what kind of relationship will we have with the director? And you hope that you both have a really good relationship with the director, because I've seen it where some people have a good relationship with the director and the other editor doesn't, and it builds tension and it's not really fruitful. But Lee and I, we hit it off right at the get-go.
Yeah.
We really worked well together, all three of us. It was one of the best experiences I have had.
Yeah.
When you're in an environment like that, where you're working with another editor for the first time, you might have both worked with the same people before, you might know the same people. What do you do to get to know that person? Do you guys just sit down and talk about the film together and just come up with your own battle plan, or is it more or less left to the director to decide how this is all going to work?
For us, it was really Matt and I kind of deciding how we thought the best approach was, obviously with Kate's blessing, but we thought that if we could work it out amongst ourselves, then, Kate could focus on directing, which is what she really was wanting to do in that early production phase of things. She just wanted to be told if there was a problem or if there were any concerns or anything. And then other than that, she was leaving it in our hands to decipher and to get through and to decide who was cutting which scenes. And again, because we all three were new to each other and had never worked with each other, she was happy just to let us work it out. And then once we came back together in post-production, she would work with Matt or she would work with myself with whatever scenes we had cut, and then work with us together to make sure that the film was in a cohesive form so that it was blending together well.
During the course of these interviews, I often ask about the overall workflow for a film, and I'll be honest, the results aren't always great. I think that the question itself might be too big or maybe even too general of a question to ask. So in this case, I thought I would focus on one scene and let that be emblematic of your overall process. And to avoid spoiling anything as much as possible, I'm thinking about the action scene that opens the film. It's a scene of young Natasha and her seemingly nuclear family suddenly having to go on the run and escape being pursued by some kind of authorities. And they're going to do this via a small plane, which is piloted by her mother while her father is fending off the people coming after them. I don't know who cut this scene or if you both cut it, but if you could just sort of walk me through what the evolution of that scene is from script to storyboards to previs, stunt phase. What is the life cycle of a scene like that from beginning to end?
Like a lot of Marvel stuff, it always starts out with, all movies kind of start off with the director's vision and the script, and it makes its way to storyboard form. But Marvel is keen on previs and really kind of working out the action scenes beforehand, just because usually they're big and there's elements that are hard to shoot. And so the more we fleshed out we can get it with storyboards and previs and stunt viz, the better off we are. So that scene was a bunch of rounds of previs and focusing in and tightening it and, shooting at night is a huge challenge. And then having two units go out and shoot and always chasing. First unit will shoot, we'll cut that together, we'll send it out to the second unit who's going out there in like a couple days. So they have the reference of what it needs to match into, and people in a plane, people outside of a plane. When it functions with everything that's set in place, kind of how we're used to doing things with the storyboard, the previs, and the director usually has time in pre-production to kind of go through the previs and everything, kind of get the idea and hone it in. Once we started shooting, it was up to Lee and I to get the previs and all that in order, because the director usually doesn't have a lot of time to sit down and kind of fine tune something like that. So we would take that from our previs house, third floor, and we would fine tune it and show it to Kate, and then give it to second unit and really kind of get it as tight as possible, and where Kate was really happy with the sequence, and use that as a guide to shoot. Not that they shoot it identically to that, but it's usually a good stepping off point. And then once dailies come in, there are always the logistical problems. We couldn't get the plane that fast. We couldn't get cars that fast. We couldn't do this. We couldn't, And so it's an ever-evolving process as both units are shooting. And second unit will come into my office. We'll sit there and go through stuff and figure out ways to troubleshoot and condense stuff. If the schedule's too short to shoot everything they want, we'll meet with Kate and we would kind of hone in and kind of fine-tune it that way before second unit goes out and shoots. And so we're very kind of specific and conscientious of what needs to be shot and schedule-wise.
Audiences are going to have the choice of seeing this film in the theater or seeing it at home on Disney+. And of course, the theater-going experience is going to be greater, but it isn't just greater for the visuals, but certainly also for the sound. In a film like this, you get to play around with surround and big sound effects to create a really immersive experience for the audience. And at the same time, amidst all that bombastic sound during these action sequences, there's dialogue that needs to be understood so that jokes can pay off or so the audience doesn't get lost. Having just asked you about the visual iterations an action scene goes through, how about the sonic aspect? How do you go about building the soundscape so that you get this great immersive experience, but also one that is clearly understood?
I think the first few conversations with the sound team are just, again, Kate's vision for sound palettes of the movie and then individual for each scene and what she envisioned the sound of the movie to be overall. Obviously, the sound department and Skywalker Sound was amazing. So they take what we do in our Avid tracks as a guide. And, we've worked with Kate and we've tried to hone our part in building the soundscape, the sounds that she wants to hear for each scene and what we think each scene should sound and play to bring that environment alive for the film. And so keeping that conversation alive with the sound department as we maneuvered through our process of editing and our discovery of environment and character and just, again, working with Kate and finding out exactly what she wanted as we were getting deeper and deeper into the editing process, we were able to refine so that when we would give turnovers to the sound department, then they were able to take that and continue to build from that. And again, just telling them what our experiences were with Kate as far as a soundscape and what she was wanting to have in background sounds. There's this one scene that comes to mind. And in fact, the opening scene, which Matt cut so beautifully, where it starts in a neighborhood. And Kate was very specific to say, I want the sounds of someone mowing the lawn in the background. I want to hear some dogs barking. I want to hear the children playing, just to really bring the neighborhood alive. And so you might not see a guy mowing the lawn, but you can create that environment so it really feels like it's a rich environment, like it's very believable. And again, it's all just...
It's all texture.
Yeah, it just adds the texture. Exactly.
And it's those things that we find out, we thought we did a really nice job with our temp tracks and sound effects and all these things to make the movie play for this. When you show it to the studio, when you show it to an audience, you have all these layers and textures and make the film come to life. And then you get on the mixing stage and it's something different. And sometimes you fall in love with what you have in the Avid. And the first time you're on the mixing stage, it's always like this unique experience. It's always like, okay, I've been living with it for 8 months now, and here we go. And I'll tell you what, our sound team, Skywalker and Laura Hirschberg and Juan Peralta and Shannon Mills, Dan Laurie from Skywalker, they just knocked it out of the park. And on this, we had the luxury of sitting on the mixing stage. They let us go into the mixing stage, and we worked remotely at Disney. It was just the three of us. And our music editor, Robbie Boyd, he was there kind of in the back room. He would come in at times just with COVID protocol. And they piped it into the stage from Skywalker, which is up north in Northern California. And oh my gosh, it was such an amazing experience because we could just sit there and have this long Zoom call with the mixers and go through the movie and just sit there because usually we have visual effects meetings, we have editorial sessions, we have all these things that prevent us from going to the mixing stage and finessing the sound and getting the balance right and really weighing in on what things should sound like and where they should be panned. It was one of the benefits because we locked the movie and we had the time to go in and do it. And it was absolutely amazing. And Kate was amazing on the soundstage. The things she came up with, the things that she did, it was surprising to all of us, but it just really added to the layers of the movie. And it was pretty fantastic.
So I said I was going to focus on one scene to be emblematic of the film, and I admit I lied. There is another one I think we need to talk about because it is the antithesis of that first scene. And it's the kind of scene that comes up a lot as being deceptively hard, and that is a dinner scene, which is typically much quieter and less complex than an elaborate action set piece, of which there are plenty in Black Widow. So rather than talk about visual effects and action, since there aren't really any in this scene, let's talk about hitting the right notes tonally, and also the challenge of cutting a more intimate scene, where the audience is really clued into the reactions of the characters and being able to understand the dynamics of what the characters are feeling and the dynamics going on between them.
That dinner scene just cut itself, right, Lee?
I think he's talking about your dinner scene, though.
No, I think he's talking about your dinner scene.
Well, let's talk about both dinner scenes. We'll compare dinner scenes.
Matt, you go first.
My dinner scene was pretty simple and really quick. And that's at the beginning of the movie when the family has to go on the run. But I think you're talking about the bigger dinner scene when the family kind of...
reconvenes. Yes, you are correct.
Reconvenes. Because that, oh my gosh.
That was a handful.
That was a handful, and that's all Lee. I mean, I stayed away from that with a 10-foot pole. Because they're all amazing actors and all funny, and David Harbour's ad-libbing, and it's all hilarious, and Rachel Weisz is getting in on the joke. And Lee, go for it. Explain that one, because it really turned out great, but I was overwhelmed just watching the dailies.
You're very kind, both of you. What was your question again?
That's what comes from asking questions that are way too wordy or much wordier than they should be. The question is about really just the deceptive challenge of what appears to be a smaller scene like that, a dinner scene where you have no place to hide edits and it's all about looks and giving the audience time to really perceive what a character is feeling. Those are really hard to cut.
Yeah, the dinner scene did present a few challenges just because, like Matt said, you have all these wonderful actors, and it was like an embarrassment of riches almost because there's so much material to work with. And it was just deciding really what was at the heart of the scene and what did we need to convey to the audience in that moment. And so just trying to keep that in mind and keep focused on that really helped us to pare down the lesser needed moments of the scene so that we could just really focus on Natasha's experience, because it's coming from her point of view, and then we shift and it's coming from Yelena and then Melina's point of view. And so I guess that was the tricky part of that scene, was being able to facilitate the point of view of each character, because they all have a moment within that scene, and being able to bring it back to a very poignant moment as a family dynamic. Because I think that's a touchstone for every audience viewer, is we've all come from a family of sorts, whether it was dysfunctional or perfectly wonderful. You can all relate to some sort of a family setting. Just keeping that in mind as far as like the dynamics of it, but then trying to be true to each character and keep coming back to Natasha's point of view, because ultimately it's her story.
Well, Matt, you said, what was fun about that is David Harbour doing some ad-libbing. His character definitely carries some of maybe the bulk of the comedic workload. Was there a lot of ad-libbing in this film, and does it typically come in the form of comedic bits?
Yeah, it's kind of, Kate was very open to the actors ad-libbing and just kind of riffing on it. But more so, it was, the dinner scene was, where a bulk of it was. And David Harbour with his mannerisms and his gestures, and he's improv. He's quick, he's fast, he's funny. And so is Rachel Weisz. They're all, Scarlett, Florence, they're all amazing actors, and they can all improv. They all have ideas, and they're really smart. And that sometimes becomes the challenge. An embarrassment of riches, like Lee was saying. It's really tough to sit there and cut really good actors, especially when they're ad-libbing, because it's very subjective. That's the toughest part. 9 times out of 10, any of their performances will work. That's the tough job as an editor, to sit there, and especially before you have feedback from the director, it's what to keep and what to lose. And Lee and I kind of We had the same ideas, same kind of sensibilities, and luckily it lined up with Kate and it lined up with the movie because you want to keep the same tone. You don't want characters to go outside of their wheelhouse. Like, Natasha's character wouldn't do this, but we get spoiled on these movies. Marvel has a way of casting, and they usually knock it out of the park. And with that comes, really good performances and really good actors. And we're very fortunate in Black Widow that, oh my gosh, there's not a
You don't have to cut around anybody.
No, you don't. And then sometimes that makes it even more difficult.
It's great that people who aren't able to, or maybe they're not ready to see a film in the theaters, they can do that at home on Disney+. The movie theater, as I said before, is where a film like this is best experienced if you can do that. And if you do go see it in the theater and in an IMAX presentation, I've read there are about 22 minutes of the film that are presented in true IMAX. So how does the IMAX component affect you as editors? Is there anything you have to do differently? Any additional work you need to do or things you need to pay attention to when you're cutting a sequence that you know will be presented in IMAX?
I think ultimately you just approach every scene the same, which is to tell the best story that you can. And Matt, you might have a different answer, but for me, I don't look at the IMAX initially as any different than how any other non-IMAX scenes might be. Towards the end, when they say, okay, this is going to be part of the IMAX, then you go back and you look at it and you're like, okay, so we repoed this for 240. We don't need to repo it for IMAX. Or clearly we're going to be seeing more image. So there may be little adjustments that you make afterwards when you find out. But initially going into it, I don't edit it differently out of the gate.
Yeah.
I approach it all the same. And then when they say this is part of the IMAX to take advantage of the greatness of all these visual effects and just what they shot, then you're like, yeah, awesome, cool. We'll take all these repos off, or we'll adjust a little bit here and there. More of the visual effect is going to get seen. So that's great.
Yeah. I always kind of cut in the aspect ratio that the movie's in. And then we'll go and we look at all the visual effect shots. We look at everything if it was shot for IMAX or shot in 240. But it's those big scenes. It's the action scenes that are usually the ones that are for the IMAX screens. And that's when the movie opens up. And when you're watching your monitors and work and stuff, it's hard to see just how it really does open up until you get on the big screen and see it in IMAX and you go, oh, wow. Because it's such a great format. It's so amazing to sit in an IMAX theater and see and have specific scenes that were shot for it. And when we're cutting it, you do have to worry about like visual effects and what's in and what's out of frame and sound design. And so we do a whole IMAX pass for the sound just to make sure that there's nothing that was missed. We try to get the movie in the best shape possible before we start diving into those other iterations of IMAX and Atmos and these other things that really enhance the viewing experience. But first and foremost, I think Lee and I, and Kate too, we all just approached it as making the best movie possible. And then we would address those things after the fact.
Matt, I'm sure you remember this like it was yesterday, but you and I first met on location for Iron Man 3, which would have been back in 2012. 9-10 years ago, something like that.
Oh my God.
And that was only the 7th film into this now 24 film MCU run. How has the post-production process, whether in terms of tools or technique, evolved from your perspective since back then? Anything significant that sticks out to you?
Their model for making movies has kind of always been the same, giving you the tools to make the best movie possible, whether that be multiple storyboard artists, previs artists, post-viz artists, which you need on these movies because there's flying characters. It's pretty intense and really heavy workload to visualize. And I think from Iron Man 3, the process is pretty much the same, which is why the movies all have the same kind of feel and through line. And Kevin and Victoria and Lou are still in all the meetings that they were from Iron Man to now. It's a very hands-on approach. And everything they allowed us to do on Iron Man 3, they still allow us to do now, maybe on a little bit bigger of a scale, but it's what makes all these movies function on the level that they function on, because they never kind of spared any expense and they knew what it took to get the creative side of it told.
One thing that has changed is back on Iron Man 3, you were first assist on that. For both of you, at some point in your careers, you were assisting and then made the move into lead editing. So as we wrap things up here, Lee, I thought I would start with you. And just what was the turning point in your career where you were able to make the jump from assistant to editor? What were the circumstances? Who was the mentor? What was the situation that helped you move from assistant to lead editor?
I was very fortunate because I worked with a wonderful editor, Christian Wagner, who allowed me from the very first project I ever assisted him on, Man on Fire. He allowed me to cut scenes for him. And so I was able to just grow that experience and continue cutting scenes. And we were on a project and he had given me a scene to cut and I kept working on it and doing the notes and everything. And then he told me years later, I knew that you were ready to move on and I was going to quickly lose you as an assistant because you did so well on that scene. And that went through the whole gauntlet of studio notes and director notes and everything. And it had very few changes. And so I knew then that it was only a matter of time before you were going to want to ask for more. And, like you were going to try to jump out of the nest. And so that was very nice to hear. And that was my process. I took the time and I took the scenes that I was given to try to cultivate my own skill set. And every day coming to work, it's a continuation of that. Even now, like Matt said, you're always learning from the people that you work with and the directors that you're working with in whatever situation. It's always a learning experience. And so personally, I just try to take that and do better, try to make my skill set better tomorrow than it was today.
So Matt, that all happened for you within the Marvel universe. So same question for you, because I'd like to know how that all applies within the MCU, going from assistant to lead editor.
Yeah, right place, right time. My first movie with Marvel was Avengers, which Jeff Ford was cutting with Lisa Lassick. And I had met Jeff years ago when he came on for a brief time on a movie I was assisting on over at Fox. And, we kind of hit it off. I asked him for some career advice. And then years later, I ended up working with him again on Avengers. And then he asked me to be his first on Iron Man 3. And Jeff gave me a break on Captain America 2, Winter Soldier. An opportunity came, and Jeff backed me, and some of the visual effects people, and Jen and Lisa backed me as well to step up into that chair and cut with Jeff. And Victoria Alonso over at Marvel was a big proponent of pushing me forward, and I was very lucky. Jeff and I worked really well together and really just kind of helped me hone my craft. And I really do owe everything to Jeff Ford. I mean, because he really kind of mentored me and he would always give me scenes to cut. And if I have any advice for assistant editors or people who want to cut, it would be don't fall into an assistant rut. Keep on cutting side projects. Ask to cut scenes, whether they make it in the movie or not. Show that you're interested in it and engaged. And, because for a while there, I had kids. I was a really good assistant. And Jeff was starting to give me stuff to cut. And I'd sit there and watch him and he would give me notes. And you listen, you watch, you learn. I would watch, what he would do when he would leave at night. I would sit there and go and watch the idea of what I thought a scene would be, and then I would watch what he would do. And it was such a learning process from all the movies I assisted on. I always did that. I would always watch how editors worked and what they would choose and how they worked with directors. And because it really is, it's not just editing itself. It's the juggling act of studio execs and directors and personalities and being able to play kind of a political game of sorts and navigating all these different personalities. Sometimes that's tougher than cutting the movie.
It's been a long road dating back to May 2019 for this film. Now that it's finally here, will you go see it in the theater? And when your name comes up on the screen, will you stand up and yell, "That's me"?
I won't be doing that, but I will be seeing the movie opening weekend for sure. And we did just see it with an audience last week, which was absolutely amazing after such a long period of time, sitting kind of, on the shelf per se and seeing it with an audience in a theater. It was the first time I've been back in the theater since this whole thing started.
It was a fan event, a fan premiere. And like Matt was saying, it was my first time in the theater as well. And it was an amazing first time.
That's why I love working on these movies. I love seeing it in the theater. I love entertaining people. And that's kind of what it's, there's no better feeling than listening to people laugh or clap or get a little weepy or it's so much fun to see it with an audience.
Yeah, just to see the fans react and the laughter and their range of emotions really was a wonderful experience.
And just like that, the blockbusters are back. Go see Black Widow in theaters if you can, or check it out on Disney+. Either way you see it, you have the brilliant editorial work of Matthew Schmidt and Lee Folsom Boyd on full display. A summer blockbuster size thank you to both of them for making the time to talk with us today. They are super crazy busy right now, and for that I thank them all that much more for joining us. Do you have a blockbuster story to tell, or even perhaps a little indie darling you just know is destined for Sundance? Either way, Avid Media Composer is the nonlinear editing tool for the job, and it has never been more powerful and easier to acquire than it is right now. As always, there's a link in the show notes just for you. Before we say goodbye, just another quick reminder to show our sponsors some love and attention. It's a nice thing for them, definitely a nice thing for me, and certainly a good thing for you if you've got work to do. And I know I've got some work to do, so I gotta go now. Until we meet again, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.